Let's begin.
Hey there, scary story fanatics. Welcome back to Fleeting Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Summer has come to an end, but I think it's time we hit up the lake for one last glorious excursion and relive some memories past. So settle in by your monitor screens and pop some popcorn. It's time for a retelling of the longest Locust Lake story to date, the Black Woods. Just a gosh darn summer camp.
The sun was just beginning to set behind the far side of the distant mountain range. It had shined brightly throughout the day, but this time of year, the sun can be largely deceiving. The area was northeast Pennsylvania, and the time of year was early spring. Coupled with a moderate altitude of where Gabe was working, the air had a distinct, biting chill to it, despite the enveloping sunshine. Gabe was hired to do some early spring cleaning at the local campground. The owners were wanting to get the camp mended and refurbished before it got too late in the spring, in hopes of securing a bit of side business for the grounds, while simultaneously providing a service to the local township and its youths.
We're just about set here for the day, boys. Hey, Gabe.
Gabe heard his boss call out from him from behind. He jolted around to gain sight of him, but as he did, his feet slid out from underneath him in the thick and saturated Pennsylvania clay. Gabe took a fall, landing on his side in the mud, his crewmates chuckling and laughing as each noticed his mishap. As he struggled to his feet, Gabe looked up at his boss once again, retaining his focus as he regained his posture. The foreman shook his head side to side, a large grin on his aged, leathery face. He joshed Gabe about his fall, making an inappropriate remark correlating the status of the soil and female genitalia. He then told him that he was blowing the whistle on the workday, meaning Gabe would be left to finish up. Gabe was the newest member to the crew, meaning he did most of the grunt work. His job, on Fridays, was to put tools away and lock up open gang boxes before accompanying the rest of the crew down at the local bar.
Hey man, you want a hand?
Donnie asked him, as the rest of the crew got into their vehicles and left for the day.
Nah man, I got it,
Gabe responded to him. Gabe and Donnie were really good friends. In fact, it was Donnie who had gotten him the job here. Donnie's parents owned the land and agreed to put in a good word for him for the people who would be operating the grounds this summer, securing him a lucrative summer job if he agreed to help out with the initial spring cleanup and repair. Donnie agreed, knowing it would likely be a lot of work, and he asked Gabe to help, assuring him that he could secure him the same deal. It ended up being Gabe's job to be everyone's gopher, retrieving requested tools and equipment. When he found himself unoccupied, it was his job to search the freshly melted grounds for stray refuse and debris. Had the weather been a little bit warmer, it would have been a ton more enjoyable. But this early in the season, the lake itself hadn't even finished melting, only having done so where the ice met shoreline. The reason Donnie's parents wanted to begin so early, as they explained to him, A, to get the camp ready for campers as soon as possible, and B, act as a deterrent from any would-be future break-ins. A few weeks beforehand, the owners returned to the open gates to the camp and inspected the seasonal damage to the cabins and grounds. What they discovered was the main cabin having been ransacked. Both the door and the side window had been busted out, the inside seemingly vandalized, as if done by a teenage vandal, and several decorations made by previous campers at a camp they used to run down south had gone missing. This was Donnie's job. Donnie's duties mainly included repair to that cabin. He didn't feel right just leaving Gabe behind to head down to the bar, but Donnie had just turned 21 a little over a month beforehand, so Gabe didn't have to do much convincing in telling him that it was okay to leave and that he would catch up with him soon. He finished by reassuring him that it wouldn't take him long to put things away, only a couple extra minutes, as he so eloquently put it.
Don't get yourself killed,
were Donnie's last words to Gabe as he retreated to his car, stuffing the last of the small items of inorganic refuse into the pocket of his work jacket. Both Gabe and Donnie were well aware of the urban legends that involved this little camp, but Donnie had been coming here off and on his entire life, and never experienced anything more terrifying than a slightly larger than normal bullfrog that he nicknamed the alligator frog. Something that wasn't very frightening at all. So, naturally, Donnie was able to easily remedy any of Gabe's apprehensions about working here. That final thought, though, provoked a smirk from Gabe, but that smirk only masked the bubbling anxiety that began to build as soon as Donnie started his car and began to drive away, leaving Gabe all alone at the camp. Gabe tromped from one end of the campground to the next, putting stashes of tools in places where they would easily be found, and once he finished, he could finally gather up his own stuff and wrap up for the day himself. Gabe was on his way to drop off his tool bucket, an emptied pail filled with the necessary daily tools to complete job tasks, when he saw a glint of something shine in the setting sun close to where he had last been working. When he recognized it as a tape measure, he instinctively patted his tool belt with his right hand, noticing that his tape measure was not there, where it should have been. Deducing that it must have jostled free during his fall, Gabe set the bucket down where he stood before proceeding down the slight bank to the shore. Just before reaching his destination, Gabe's feet once again shifted out from underneath him, sending him sliding down to the thin layer of water separating earth from lake ice. Gabe stopped short of the ice by far, his buttocks resting firmly on the muddy ground, only his right boot breaking through the ice, soaking his right pant leg halfway up to his knee with frigid, muddy lake water. Slightly frustrated, Gabe recentered his hand beneath him to gain mobility and lifted himself free from the mud and water. As he did, something beneath the ice grabbed a hold of his ankle and pulled him back down, sliding closer to the edge of the shore.
What the fuck? Help!
Gabe screamed and pleaded with anything that might hear him, the grip on his ankle tight and unrelenting. A few seconds later, the hold on Gabe's leg ceased its grip, allowing him to back up a bit before standing to his feet and running in the opposite direction of the lake. A million thoughts went through his head in a split second, the most prominent of which begged the question, what the fuck was that? He hadn't gotten more than 10 feet when he heard the distinctive cracking sound behind him. Gabe slowly turned his head to see a large black figure break through the lake ice, erupting from the black murky depths of the water below, bathed in the gloomy luminescence of twilight. Gabe was about to run, and that is exactly what he did after a split second of paralyzing fear, but in that moment of paralysis, the droplets of water and pieces of ice flying through the air settled into place, presenting Gabe with a surreal, impossible image, staring back at him. As Gabe sprinted to his car, screaming for help as loud as he could, his mind wrestled with the visual stimuli it had been provided. A man, or a creature, burst through the ice near the shore, presumably the thing that had grabbed his ankle. The thing was built like a man, but impossibly so. It wore a long, wet, and muddy black coat. Its hands were covered in saturated black gloves, and its face was covered by a dark brown mask that appeared to be made of swollen driftwood and sported a devilish expression of a man. Its mouth locked into an almost indistinguishable smirk, its eyes narrow and seemingly vacant, the orifices forming around two bottomless black voids. When his hand touched the handle of his car, Gabe felt something grab a hold of the right side of his ear. The grip was cold and wet, and the smell of it was intensely foul, like mildew mixed with rot. When Gabe jerked his head to get free, he realized the thing had a hold of his ear. The thing pulled back when he jerked away, tearing the earlobe from Gabe's head. Gabe grabbed the side of his face just as the thing reached forward again, grabbing his left arm in one hand and Gabe's right shoulder in his left. Before he could react, Gabe's arm was snapped in two near the shoulder joint. The figure glared emotionlessly at his squirming and screaming victim through the empty sockets of its mask. Ignoring the agony, Gabe was still hoping to fight this thing off, but it threw its hands forward with a force no human should be able to muster, tossing him to the ground on his back. Gabe watched the tall, black silhouette of this being approaching him. He cried and kicked his feet wildly, trying to fend it off, but it was his legs it was after. Grabbing a hold of each with a strong, wet grasp, it began to walk backwards towards the lake, its feet squashing with each subsequent step. Tears welled up in Gabe's eyes. He started pleading for his life. Whatever held him seemed not to even be listening, as it methodically placed its hand in strategic positions on Gabe's right leg and then proceeded to break it. Gabe screamed out as the crack of his breaking femur seemed to echo off the tree line. He didn't even finish crying out when the thing broke the other. Panic and terror replaced all conscious thought as Gabe realized that he was about to die. The thing bent over, lending a slight visual of the features of his mask, gripped the clothing over Gabe's thorax, while firmly placing his left foot on Gabe's right arm, pinning it to the ground. As he lifted, his foot never budged an inch, tearing Gabe's arm from its socket with a pop, leaving it on the ground. Blood from the now gushing wound flung into the air, fanning outward, after the creature reeled back and tossed him far out onto the thin lake ice. Gabe's mutilated body broke right through it on collision. As he felt his life slowly fading away, Gabe realized with all broken or missing limbs, he was bound to sink, doomed to drown. The last thing he caught sight of was the creature on shore bend down and retrieve Gabe's severed arm, tossing it out into the water to join its owner. Gabe heard the splash above him as he sank below the water and remaining ice. It was a beautiful day, likely the most beautiful day of the entire summer thus far. It was late July with an abundance of warm, enveloping sunshine, but the gentle breeze that carried across the mountainous landscape cooled the air to a more comfortable level. The humidity was surprisingly low, and as the result of the conditions, the children were playing heartily in the open field to the east of camp, supervised by two of the camp's young counselors, Donnie and Aaron. The other two remaining counselors were performing separate tasks. One of them, 22-year-old Ned, was assisting his boss, Nate, in mending the fence nearest the boys' cabin. In the girls' cabin, 21-year-old Dana was busy making the children's beds, 6 in total, as most of these children neglected to do so. After she had finished, and before she left, Dana grabbed the small oil lamp from the plywood nightstand in her room and tucked it behind a corner of a piece of foam Nate called a mattress, so as to hide it for the time being. Nate made sure to go over the camp rules with everyone, including the children. One of the rules was no fires of any kind in the cabins. The camp ran on a generator, and Dana wouldn't need it, but she decided to have it handy in case the infamous old and faulty lines of the camp happened to cease functioning. She knew Nate would have something to say about it, especially in one of the children's cabins, but Dana chose to keep it on hand anyway. That is, until one of the campers saw it and reminded her that she shouldn't have that inside. To negate any future complication, she stashed it from sight. Dana left the little brown wooden cabin trimmed in yellow and left to join the others in the field. Dana walked down a dirt path that stretched across the camp's side of the lake. She looked down onto the water and savored the tranquility of the lofty location. Her awareness of her surroundings seemed to dissipate, fostering a moment of blissful peace. It was then that she heard the scuffle of someone's foot on the dirt behind her, and before she could jolt herself back to reality to turn and look, something grabbed a hold of her right shoulder. Dana jumped and screamed out loud simultaneously, spinning around to see a smiling Ned, now beginning to hold back a chuckle.
I didn't mean to scare you.
Ned told Dana, trying not to laugh.
Listen, Nate wanted me to ask you to run over to the mess hall, see if Clefty needs anything from the market. Nate says he's making a run later.
Ned informed Dana, referring to the camp's cook who was nicknamed Clefty due to his more than distinctive cleft chin. No one in camp knew his real name, except Nate, the camp boss, but he just called him Clefty too, so the rest of the campers just followed suit.
Yeah, I don't mind. Does he want me to check back with him?
Nah, he said just give him a heads up about it. He said he's gonna stop in and write down a list later.
Dana chatted with Ned for a few more moments before parting ways and deviating her trajectory towards the mess hall. The man with a ridiculously cleft chin was busy chopping some onions for adding to the night's meal, home-cooked venison chili. One of the better features of the camp was a small child group, 6 boys and 6 girls, so it was easier to afford the items necessary for creating a good meal. Still, Clefty had to cook for 20 people, including himself, 3 meals a day, a task not so easily accomplished. At least this group of kids wasn't fussy.
Hey, Clefty?
The man jolted around in shock, grazing the top of his hand against the bubbling silver pot, steaming with heat. As Clefty forced a smile to his face for Dana's sake, he held his hand with the other, muttering out a small, deep grunt, almost a yelp.
Sorry, seems I did to you what I just suffered.
What do you mean? Clefty inquired.
Oh, nothing. It's not important. Hey, Nate wanted me to tell you he's going to the market later and asked if you need anything. He said he'll be by later to check in with ya. Just wanted to give you a heads up.
Dana gave him a smile back.
Sorry for making you hurt yourself.
Dana finished. The old man told her that it was fine, that he'd suffered worse, and then thanked her for delivering the message. With that, Dana left him to his work. An hour or so had passed by with the children playing in the open field, next to a small running stream that separated the grounds from the vacant little house below, all while under the supervision of now 3 young adults. It had gotten later in the day, and the group was now gathering together and readying for a group walk back down the trail by the lake shore, stopping short of the bunk bed-filled cabins and filing into the small mess hall, built to comfortably house approximately 30 people. As the children stood in line, single file, to collect chili-filled bowls, prepared by Clefty, Erin stood watch, waiting until everyone else had seated before acquiring her own. Just as she was getting ready to position herself at the back of the now dwindling line, camp boss Nate came around through the door at the end of the line from behind the kitchen. Seeing him coming from a ways off, Erin lifted her gaze to greet him as he approached her. Hey, I'm headed into town to grab a few things. Do me a favor, will you? If you happen to come across Garrison, can you ask him to adjust the hinges on the door to my cabin? The summer heat and humidity seems to have swollen the door jamb, and it's not shutting properly. I would have told him myself, but I haven't seen him, and he was supposed to be back about an hour ago, Nate explained to an intently listening Erin in regards to the camp's groundskeeper, called by his last name, Garrison.
Sure, no problem, boss,
Erin assured Nate. After attaining her dinner and seating herself with the rest of the crew, she informed them of the boss's request. Nate was already long gone and heading down the dirt road toward civilization. The only individual not in attendance at the mess hall was tucked away in the woods by a stream, far from the tree line that bordered the east side of the field. The running brook bubbled with sound as it trickled by Garrison, sitting on a log deep within the forest. Garrison was an older man in his late 40s, and despite his usual conservative appearance, he was a closet cannabis smoker.
Man, I'm fucking stoned,
Garrison blurted out to himself, finishing off the last few puffs of the roach, previously a full joint comprised of some really high-end grass. The more zoned out he was becoming, the more he pondered the small arsenal he had found in Nate's cabin. A stash including handguns and even a couple half-sticks of dynamite. Garrison knew the rednecks around here liked to blow stuff up, but he didn't think one would be stupid enough to keep it in a child's summer camp, even if it was well hidden within the main cabin. Off limits to nearly everyone except for the boss himself. Garrison tossed the speck of a roach into the nearby running creek that trickled deeper into the forest behind him. As he fumbled for the cigarettes in his pants pocket, the smell of marijuana dissipating, and a shift in the gentle breeze that swirled about the trees, the aromas of weed and hemlock were replaced by an overwhelmingly foul stench. He would have just gone the other direction, making his way back to camp, but he considered himself to be obligated, being the groundskeeper, and followed the running water towards the source of the odor. The smell grew thicker, more definably rancid, yet as overpowering as it became, he couldn't quite place definition upon it, even after he saw the odd-looking mass up ahead in the center of the creek. Pushing closer to it, he recognized that it was big, relatively spherical shape, and two-toned, one half fluorescent orange and the other half faded blue. The two colors separated by what looked like a band of brown and yellow. Even within 15 feet, the only detail he was able to attain was the fleshy surface of the oval-like mass, dangling streaks of black, dark hair into the running water. Once nearly over top of it, his brain finally attained its equilibrium, and Garrison now understood exactly what horror he was looking at, immediately followed by vomiting from the overwhelming stench. In the water at his feet was a bloated corpse of a human being that he did not recognize. It was a man lying face down, whom seemed to have been there for a while, and one way or another had lost one of his arms. The only identifiable feature that he could obtain was the words imprinted at the back of the fluorescent yellow shirt, now stretched nearly to capacity. Camp Cleanup Crew. Garrison finished gagging, trying desperately to inhale gulps of the nearly toxic air, but he couldn't avoid it. He had to turn away, and as he spun around, trying to cover his nose and mouth with his hands, he saw something far worse behind him. That's when he realized that the smell wasn't emanating from the corpse. Rather, it was a compilation of it and the monstrosity now before him. A dark, wooden mask with a sinister smile, along with its long, black appearance, was all he could take in before turning to run, but it was already too late. A worn, rotted fabric gloved hand gripped each of his shoulders, one giving release long enough to pull back and deliver such a powerful strike to his lower spine that the resulting crack echoed off the trees that surrounded the two of them. The beast allowed his prey to drop to the forest floor, standing over its victim for a few moments, relishing in its agonizing movements of squirming around in the leaves and pine needles beside the creek and Gabe's bloated corpse. Garrison intensely struggled to get free, but managed only in rolling himself onto his back, staring straight up at his tall, unnatural attacker. He was gasping for air and belting out short, agonizing screams with what he could collect. But that ended when the creature grasped a hold of a stick beside Garrison's head and plunged it forcefully into his throat. The only thing Garrison managed to accomplish by moving his head was snapping the stick off beneath the surface of the skin. Jacob sauntered off into the woods, ignoring the gasping, broken man laying half in the creek next to a 4-month-old decaying corpse, and disappeared into the maze of trunks and branches. Evening had turned into nightfall, and Nate had yet to return to camp. The children, all 12 of them, sat close to a crackling fire pit, emanating warmth and flickering light. With them sat 3 of the 4 camp counselors, Aaron, Dana, and Ned. Donnie had informed the huddled group that he was going to turn in early, having had a long day. Darkness surrounded them on all sides, at the fringes of the circle of where firelight became too weak to overcome the darkness beyond. "Tell us a scary story. You told us you'd tell us a scary story tonight." One of the children, a boy named Matthew, aimed his statement at Ned, from across the fire pit, on the left end of a wooden bench next to Aaron. Ned thought for a moment, quibbled humorously with the boys as to whether or not he should, but eventually took advantage of the long silence before beginning his story.
Okay, so this one time, about 40 years ago, there was this mental patient who escaped from the mental institution, and one night...
Oh, wait, I've heard this one like 1,000,000 times, and everyone knows it's not real. You said you'd tell us something really scary. Matthew interjected Ned mid-sentence. Ned took a deep breath, asked the boy if he was sure, and after a quick yes and a crescendoing riot from the rest of the children, Ned began to tell them a different tale.
Okay, so you really want to hear something scary, huh? Well, this one is true. It happened right here, on the ground that we're all sitting on tonight. A long time ago, sometime back in the 1980s, there was this boy named Jacob Treagle. Jacob was an only child, and he lived in a house, right here, right where that main cabin is standing.
Ned pointed off into the direction of the main cabin.
Jacob was a good child, always did what his parents told him to do. So one day, his mom tells him to take some things up the mountain. From what I've been told, his dad was building some kind of hunting cabin or something up there. Anyway, Jacob gathers up all the things his mother had told him and put them in this old beat-up car, right? This old wreck that they used to drive on these old trails.
You mean the ones that we're not allowed to go on? Another boy asked.
Yeah, but back then, they owned all of this. Most of the land that surrounds this lake, and a good portion of the mountain it's on. So on his way up there, Jacob sees these kids all messing around with his dad's stuff. He gets out of the car and starts telling them to get off the land and threatening the lot of them. In return, this group of kids beats him up right, leaving him bleeding and knocked out. The story goes, they put this kid, Jacob, in the trunk of the car and pushed it down the mountainside, causing it to blow up upon slamming into a tree.
Did he die? Matthew asked Ned.
Actually, no. See, these kids thought they had killed him and left. Jacob had survived. When his parents found him, Jacob was badly injured and disfigured. He was terribly burned and lacerated, his voice gone from inhaling the heat of the flames. Jacob's mother did not falter in her love for her child, but his dad couldn't seem to get past his deformities. Jacob didn't seem to move right. He could no longer talk, only sort of grunt, and had become accustomed to spending time alone, most of the time hiding himself in the dank, musty root cellar of his home. As time passed, Jacob's father's distaste turned into resentment, and his resentment fueled a rage inside of his son, being stoked with every indifference and verbal torment. One day, while working in the apple orchard right over there, the one next to that field you all play in, Jacob's father retrieved his son for some hard work. Full saw in hand, he had his disfigured son climb a long ladder up one of those trees to trim a branch long dead and suckling nutrients that would be best used for unhealthier ones. Once he had reached the top and began sawing at the branch, Mr. Treagle gave that ladder a good shove, sending his son to the ground in hopes of killing him. As Jacob opened his eyes, somehow no worse for wear from the fall, a broken pole saw next to his hand. Something inside of him snapped. Jacob's rage unleashed on his father as he tore at his dad over and over with the blade of that pole saw, shortened by a subsequent break from the fall. The two tussled for a while, but eventually, Mr. Treagle succumbed to his wounds and bled out, falling to the ground beside his son. Jacob tried to hide the body, but in a panic, only hid it in some bushes, leaves, and underbrush on the tree line of that old field. When he returned home, his mother caught her son, covered in blood. She asked him, yelled at him over and over to tell her what he had done. Jacob didn't speak a word, or a grunt, but ran and hid in the root cellar when his mother left the house to find her husband. Jacob expected her to be furious when she got home, but as he peeked up through the floorboards of that old house, he witnessed only a distant look of shock and despair upon her return. Mrs. Treagle didn't bother her son for the rest of the day. It wasn't until the onset of nightfall that she went to retrieve him. She took him by the hand, insisting gently that he had to come with her, and in slight reluctance, Jacob followed his mother. Jacob followed by her side until reaching the lake shore. She asked him to look out onto the lake, asked him if he remembered that time before his incident, asked him if he remembered love. A tear leaked from his eye. Jacob said nothing. And suddenly, a jolting pain on the back of his skull. Blackness ensued, and Jacob tipped forward, crashing into the lake before him and sinking beneath the surface. Dropping the large stones she held with both hands to the ground at her feet, the object she had used to strike him with, Mrs. Treagle watched her son disappear into the murky blackness. A moment passed, a long moment, and then she dropped to her knees at the lake's shoreline, clutching her face in her hands, trying to contain her agonizing weeping. In a burst of water, a figure shot from the depths and exploded into view before her. Before she could even finish her gasp, Jacob, knowing what she had done, grabbed his mother and pulled her into the lake with him, holding her beneath the rippling surface, enraged at her murderous act. When he was sure that she had stopped moving, that her life had left her, he placed her body on the lake shore, climbing out after her. People say he took the bodies of both his parents and carted them up to the mountain, making a secret gravesite for them somewhere in the forest. After that, given his circumstances, Jacob lived alone, here, in these woods. Those who have seen him say he wears a burned piece of fabric over his face to hide his hideous appearance. And they say that if you venture out onto those trails back there, going further up the mountainside, that Jacob will make you his next victim. Others say that if you speak his name, right here at camp, that he will come out of those woods right behind me, and he'll—
Ah! A tall figure jumped out of the woods behind Ned, interrupting his story, holding a large hacksaw, a dangling piece of cloth over his face. The children and the two girls on the bench with Ned both screamed in jolting fright. Ned just sat there, laughing hysterically. A quick moment later, the figure pulled the fabric from its face to reveal a smiling Donnie, now joining in with Ned in laughter.
Oh, very funny. You guys are jerks.
Aaron exclaimed to the two jokesters as Dana calmed down the now active children, 3 of them crying. Amidst it all, Matthew spoke up once again, loud enough to penetrate the sound waves of the noisy crowd. So, if that's what happened, how'd the camp get built? Why haven't the cops gone up there to get him, and how do you know all this? He asked, directing his question right at Ned.
Well, kid, I grew up here. I've heard that old story 100 times. And how did the camps get built? Well, you see, once there was no one to pay the bills for the land, the bank resumed control and sold it. Those people who bought it built this camp here. They also tore down the old Treagle house and built that little place down there by the road. But from what I understand, one of them died or something, so they ended up selling it. This place actually sat vacant for a long time, until a couple of years ago. The cops don't go up those trails to look for Jacob because he isn't real. It's just an old ghost story.
Then why are they closed off? He pressed Ned further.
Oh, they just have them off limits because they're unsafe and stuff. Rock slides and whatnot.
It was at this time that Nate's headlights could be seen coming up the drive and pulling into place in the lot, only a few feet from the fire.
Well, I don't know if it's all just a story there, Nettie. Remember Gabe?
Donnie reminded Ned. Who's Gabe? Matthew asked, completely intrigued by this story.
Oh, Gabe's just an old buddy of mine that helped clean this place up this past spring. He disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only his work bucket right there on the lakeshore.
Donnie explained, trying to exacerbate the situation. By this time, Nate had made it up to the fire, noticing the commotion and asking what everyone was talking about. Ned and Donnie said nothing, but Matthew blurted out the name, Jacob Treagle. Nate seemed to almost lose his breath for a moment, taking a long pause and then asking his counselors not to tell that particular story anymore. Ned asked him why, but Donnie didn't push the issue, cherishing his job, and put his hand up to his forehead to salute an okay. A black piece of cloth dangled in his hand. Nate eyed the small piece of fabric, his expression going blank before snapping back to reality and asking Donnie to accompany him to the side for a private conversation. Got any more stories? Matthew asked Ned as Nate and Donnie were walking away.
Yeah, actually there's an old Indian story about this place.
Nate turned back and shot Ned a glare that he immediately noticed.
But we'll save that one for another time.
Ned finished. Donnie lowered his head and headed off with the boss into the adjacent darkness. Where'd you get that? Nate asked him once they were alone.
What?
Donnie responded, confused. That. Where did you get that? Nate asked again, this time pointing to Donnie's hand, a notable increasing frustration in his tone.
What, this? This is just an old piece of trash I picked up off the ground. Right over there, actually, right in front of your cabin. It's just something I ended up stuffing into my pocket without thinking. I thought it would make a good prop for, giving the kids a scare.
Nate looked at him with disapproval in his eyes. But there was something else there. Something Donnie couldn't define. Nate asked Donnie if he could just throw it away before dismissing him and lingering where he stood, pondering the meaning of that old cloth. On that piece of fabric, plain as day, was the portion of a logo that he recognized, one that he could never forget, even if he tried. And he did try. And he spent years trying. Nate had a secret of his own. He was one of those children from that day long ago. He was one of the kids who had murdered Jacob Treagle, and that piece of fabric bore a distinct resemblance to the shirt Jacob had been wearing on that very day. Nate silently watched on as the group began packing up and putting out the fire. Then he said goodnight, walking off a few moments later. If it wasn't for the camp boss knocking on everyone's door the following morning, the entire camp would have slept in, the sky being a threatening dark gray, the thick cloud cover blockading any attempt by the sunlight to pass through. The dim light gave a lingering effect of an early morning, before the sun had risen, hence nearly everyone would have slept in through the morning. The only one of them that had gotten up before Nate was the cook, Clefty. Clefty had a habit of never sleeping in and preparing coffee for an early morning staff that may desire some. Nate was always the first to stop in. And this morning, while pouring a hot cup of his morning brew, he inquired Clefty if he knew whether or not Garrison had returned. When the cook told him that he didn't think so, Nate finished up his coffee with an unusual haste and left to see if Garrison's car was in the parking lot. Garrison lived close by and returned home every night. His car was in the parking lot the night before, when Nate had returned. The following morning, it sat right there in front of him, the same exact position it was in the night before, now covered in dew and the engine ice cold. Nate didn't waste any time in contacting the authorities about his missing groundskeeper. It had been a while, and Nate was dreading the absolute worst. He made his way across the camp to the main cabin, nearly jogging, and placed the call. The first thing the officer said to him, after being transferred, is that he'd have to wait another day to file a missing persons report, underscoring the 48-hour time period. And after asking a few more questions about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and gathering Garrison's information given to Nate at the time of employment, the police officer told Nate that he likely had nothing to worry about. Apparently, Garrison was known by many to be a heavy drinker at times. He'd have his times of sobriety and riding the wagon, but his record showed that he would frequently fall off, most of the time abandoning everything where it rested, including his vehicle. Sometimes after a bender, he'd return for his things, but it was usually months later, and most of the time he didn't. When he did, it was usually gone. Nate knew the rest of the camp to be seasonally employed or enrolled in college, looking to make some extra cash in their off-season. The policeman on the phone encouraged Nate, however, to call the following day if he had still not heard anything. With that, the two men ended the conversation. Beyond the cloud cover and the missing groundskeeper, the day was proceeding as scheduled. The air was still thick and warm, and without the looming presence of the sun, it was tolerable, as muggy as it was. The children and the counselors had already finished up the breakfast in the chow hall, all of them now on the lake shore, fishing pole in hand. Today the kids were learning to fish, assistance provided by the accompanying young adults. Nate had yet to present himself to the group. The camp boss was always in attendance at morning meal call and usually delivered the announcements for the day. Since he had already given some of the weekly plans directly to the counselors themselves, they knew what had been planned for any given day, minus any alterations. But on this particular day, Nate did not come to meet the group until they were well into fishing, the morning progressing into early afternoon. A lot of them turned to see Nate as he approached and began talking to Donnie. Nate informed him that he had some things that he wanted to do in town, but he was very vague. Before Donnie could acknowledge the information, Nate asked him to perform a task while he was away. He told him to take the mule, tools and camp equipment in the back, and drive down to the garden shed and empty the contents there, putting them back where they should be. The mule was the camp's all-terrain vehicle. It had a covered top with a bench seat and a small pickup truck-like bed in the back, presently containing a pair of gardening shears, a post hole digger, and other such devices, and sported the camp logo sign on the back, playfully depicting the camp's name, just a gosh darn camp. The word sheriff in large reflective letters beneath it, all placed beside a large corresponding emblem. Donnie agreed to help watch over things throughout the day and to fulfilling the task that Nate had asked of him. The camp boss waved goodbye to the children, proceeded to his car, got in it, and drove away, heading away from the camp with the intentions of speaking with Mrs. Garrison personally and, if possible, locate her husband.
Hey man, where's Nate headed off to?
Nettie whispered to Donnie after Nate had disappeared from sight.
He told me to put away the stuff in the back of the mule and help watch over things. Didn't really say what he was doing, only that he'd probably be a while.
Donnie responded.
Hey, can you do me a favor? Aaron and I were hoping to go for a walk by ourselves today. Think you could help cover for us for a bit?
Yeah, I don't care. Wait a minute. Where are you guys going?
Donnie asked him.
Well, I was kinda hoping to hike some of those trails that go up the mountain.
Ned hesitantly came clean.
Dude, you know those are off limits.
Donnie reminded him.
Oh, come on. Listen, I'll make a deal with you. You cover for us. Just an hour or two. I swear I'll come back and put all that shit away. Come on, man.
Ned pled with Donnie. Donnie finally agreed, caving. He was sure that the township was just embellishing the terrain and its level of hazard. A few kids run away from home and everyone suspects foul play. The forest is perfectly harmless, Donnie thought to himself in reassurance. Ned enthusiastically told Erin that they got the go-ahead, convinced her to leave their fishing rods with the others, and ventured off towards the field before heading into the woods and up the mountain, avoiding being seen by the others, mainly the children. The only person to ask Donnie where they were headed was Dana. When he let her in on what was going on, she nary gave it a second thought, everyone going about their day under a thick, cloudy sky. As the pair trekked onward through the dense forest, the sky above the canopy became thicker with the threat of rain. Ned was determined to at least walk a portion of the trail before possibly getting lucky and heading back to camp. He knew that once it started to rain, all bets were off, as Erin would surely want to return to camp. The two had walked a while, taking a couple of overgrown side trails before reaching a moderately sized meadow-like area, flat except for the occasional lump in the ground, all covered in tall grass. Nettie didn't want to waste any more time before making his move. He lured his companion into the center of the meadow before stopping mid-stride and pulling her close for an embrace. Erin responded the way that he had hoped, but just then, they heard a crashing in the woods nearby, the sounds of leaves and sticks rustling, as if something was running through the woods, and whatever it was quickly gaining proximity. They too unlocked their faces and turned just in time to see an impossibly nightmarish, hulking man-like figure, now on top of them, swinging a large piece of wood down onto the top of Ned's head, connecting with and cracking Ned's frontal cranial bone. Erin screamed, unsure if she should either help her boyfriend or run for her life. Her shock was so intense, she didn't even notice the invading, pervasive smell of wet rot. All she found herself able to truly focus upon was alternating her sight between the man's blackened, sinister-looking wooden mask and a large weapon that he was using to repeatedly bludgeon Ned with over and over again. Ned continued to convulse on the ground, even after the large wooden club finally cracked Ned's cranial cavity open like a coconut, displaying the splattered brain matter that were the bloody remnants of Ned's neocortex, now in piles on the leaves next to a flattened, now unrecognizable face. Horrified, Erin did not budge, only shrieked in terror. That is, until Jacob shot his head to the side, now focusing his attention on her. The next thing she knew, she was running. She had turned and ran as fast as she could without giving it a second thought. Erin ran through the woods, screaming for assistance at the top of her lungs, calling out for help, but she hadn't given any thought as to which way she was running. It wasn't until she had completely ran out of breath, checking her surroundings, that she realized that she had no idea where she was. She was lost in the woods, being chased by a masked maniac, and it was getting dark. The increasing darkness, however, was on account of rain, which it had now begun to do. Erin huffed in place, unsure of her next move. She checked in every direction. No sign of him anywhere. Erin threw her head back and shut her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself down and think things through. A foul odor began to fill her surroundings, and a strong yank on the back of her dangling hair is what shot her eyelids open. Her gaze was met with the upside-down face of that sinister-looking wooden mask, black, lifeless eyes, now a large, toothy blade coming into her perspective, being held in the creature's hand and raising it above his head. She let out one last scream that was cut short, feeling every tooth of it tear at her tongue and esophagus when Jacob jammed the rusted pole saw blade into her mouth and down her throat. Erin's body went limp, and Jacob let go of her. He watched as she struggled for air and fought to free the large blade from her mouth. Erin held up her hands to her now tilted back head, forced into that position by the location of the blade in her throat. She grabbed the end of it and pulled it out with the force needed. She inherently ripped her insides from her mouth past her trachea to shreds. Jacob watched his victim cough and gag up profuse amounts of blood before going pale and falling motionless on the ground beneath him, blood washing away in little rivers between the leaves. The hours had begun to pass by at camp. Donnie was getting worried about Erin and Ned, thinking they possibly may be hurt or lost on a restricted trail dubbed hazardous. The camp members had already begun filing themselves into the mess area for supper, but Donnie informed Dana he was going to take the mule and head off in search of their missing crewmates. Dana asked him to wait until Nate returned, but Donnie insisted that it would likely be dark by then, and he wanted to head out while there was still some light, despite the downpour outside. Dana agreed to stay behind and watch over the children while Donnie was gone, assuring her that he would return shortly. The rain was coming down in buckets, and by the time Donnie had made it to the all-terrain vehicle, he was already sopping wet. The sky was growing dimmer, urging Donnie to hastily make his leave. Donnie turned the engine over, placed the transmission in high gear, and headed off down the trails. Despite both the canopy provided by the trees above and the covered roof, water droplets smacked at Donnie's face as he sped up the trail, due to the lack of windshield. Before getting too far up the trail, Donnie slammed on his brakes, nearly slamming into it as he rounded the corner of the trail at such high speed. Across the trail before him resided a fallen tree, and looking at the disturbed earth and leaves, it was easy to see that it had been dragged into position relatively recently. Donnie sat and pondered at his situation for a moment or two, rolling thunder in the distance. Donnie got off the seat and walked slightly into the woods to the left, just beside the driver's seat. He was checking to see if he could squeeze the machine between the nearby trees and negate the obstruction on the trail altogether by simply driving around it. Taking a moment to size up the widths, he made the judgment that it could indeed be done. Donnie turned to return to the mule, but he was greeted by the sight of a large, soaking wet man in tattered black garments looming over him, having at least a foot on Donnie. He'd snuck up behind him, undetected, and was so close to him that Donnie nearly collided with him when he turned around. Donnie didn't have a chance to catch sight of the man's face before being knocked backwards with such force his feet left the ground. As he fell backwards, Donnie did take in the sight of the blackened, knotted wooden mask with a disturbingly sinister human-looking face carved upon it, staring at his prey as it fell, slowly lifting something large with his right arm, sopping wet with rainwater. Donnie laid there, terrified, and tried to understand the absurd display unfolding before him, raising an item that he now recognized, bringing it to the mid-plane of his body and grasping it with both hands. Jacob was holding the post-hole digger that he had retrieved from the back of the mule. Donnie rolled onto his arms and into a push-up position in an attempt to get to his feet and flee, but before he could complete the motion, he felt a large, penetrating pain, accompanied by the iciness of cold steel, reach deep into the lumbar region of his back on either side of his spinal cord. Donnie tried attempting to scream, but he found that he couldn't when Jacob clamped the post hole digger tight to either side of his vertebra, pulling up and twisting back and forth, causing Donnie's spinal column to protrude out through a large hole torn in his back. Donnie's head was compressed down into his clavicle, compressing his esophagus and stifling any attempt of shouting for help. The trauma to Donnie's brainstem resulted in his death long before Jacob finally managed to snap his spine in two with a twist before turning his attention back to the trail that Donnie had come in on. Any pervading sunlight gracing the drenched campground had now given way to utter darkness. It was past supper meal call, and due to the incessant rain, the kids were now tucked away into their cabins, having to forego the night's campfire. Clefty was left alone to tend his work, washing up the dishes from dinner and putting everything back where it was to be found at the start of every day. It was also the time in which that he could clean the oven. It was an expensive, self-cleaning oven, but he was asked it be attended while on, an obvious precaution of any establishment. Clefty heard a knocking sound behind him. He turned to see who or what was causing it, and found the door, leading directly from the kitchen area to the outside, was ajar and slightly beating against the frame, caused by the gusts of wind and pattering rainfall outside. Clefty returned to his work, dunking a tray into the sink and beginning to scrub it with a Brillo sponge pad, when he'd heard another loud slam and a subsequent creak. The cook took an extra moment to finish the tray and toss it into the drainer before turning around. The door, a gaping darkness beyond, was wide open. The rain, coming down in sheets, was beginning to run itself into the doorway and onto the floor. Frustrated, Clefty shook his hands free of water and suds and proceeded to the open door with the intention of shutting it. He approached the doorway and reached out into the darkness to grab the now open door by the knob. But before he could touch it, a toothed blade swung downward from behind the door jamb and sliced through Clefty's right arm, lopping it off mid-forearm. Clefty, under the influence of adrenaline and shock, painlessly pulled back the stump of his right arm and stared at the mangled meat and broken bone. Blood spurted and oozed from the wound, now running down what was left of his forearm and the hand that grasped it. The cook's focus shifted from his wound to the doorway. A terrifying visage stepped into its frame. Clefty turned to run, wounded arm in hand. After 2 steps, the cook slipped in water and diluted blood that had been collecting there. Laying on his stomach, Clefty never had the chance to turn and face his attacker. Before he could manage it, a large, worn black boot slammed onto the back of his skull, breaking his jaw and cleft chin against the tile floor. Clefty felt every crack, every snapped tooth, but faded into oblivion when his skull finally caved. Jacob stared down at the mess at his feet for a moment, before grabbing his legs and dragging him over towards the stove. Forcing open the locked oven door, Jason tossed his limp victim inside like a piece of trash and closed the hatch. Dana was getting really nervous about the rest of the group, waiting in anticipation for someone, particularly Nate, to return and relieve her from worry. Dana read a book in her bed inside the girls' cabin, the boys having been tucked down and assured that someone would be right outside, a slight lie on Dana's part. Little did she know that little Alyssa, a young girl in the bunk area, was waiting for her to fall asleep. Alyssa's patience would pay off. Once the lights were all off and the sounds of sleep echoed throughout the cabin, Alyssa slowly sat up and slinked to her feet, off the side of her cot. The room was nearly pitch black, but Alyssa carefully weaved past the other bunks without stirring anyone else. Once, the floor creaked beneath her feet as she crept, but no one awoke. Once at the door, Alyssa carefully opened it, making sure not to disturb anyone from sleep before stepping through the doorway and closing it just as gently behind her. The rain had stopped, but the night remained void of moonlight, the landscape soaking wet. She could barely see her hand in front of her face, but Alyssa used the outside light of the mess hall to guide her way. She was terribly hungry, having not eaten enough at supper due to talking to the other children, so she devised a plan so as to sneak out after hours and steal a late-night snack from the mess hall's kitchen. Normally, a harmless act, but on this night, a gruesome discovery was sure to ensue. Alyssa opened the doors of the cafeteria space and began walking towards the kitchen in the back. The place was dark, but the kitchen light was on, and the smell of something wonderful invaded the little girl's nose. Her mouth watered at an aroma that was reminiscent and familiar to her. Every single Christmas, instead of a turkey, ham, or goose, Alyssa's grandmother would make a roasted pork and sauerkraut dish. The smells of every holiday meal filled the little home every single year, and this smell seemed very similar to that. Alyssa couldn't wait to get her hands on some food, but something that smelled this good was beyond her expectations. Casting reservation aside, ignoring any sounds outside the mess hall, Alyssa quickened her pace into the kitchen and followed the scent right to the oven door. Firmly grasping the handle, she pulled back the door and was greeted by the broiled remains of Clefty, his eyes scabbed over with baked pus and intracellular fluid, stared out at Alyssa, seemingly right into her eyes, a look that accentuated the painful expression on the man's mutilated face, or what was left of it. Any portion of skin that wasn't covered by clothes bubbled with heat and leaked juices that hissed upon touching the hot coils that they dripped onto. Any clothing that the cook had been wearing had now turned into a sticky, melted plastic-like material that had fused to the skin and subcutaneous tissues beneath. Alyssa screamed at the top of her little lungs and ran towards the back door, stopping short of the open doorway. A thick pool of what looked like diluted mud collected on the floor. On the ground, just after the threshold, lay Clefty's amputated arm, laying in a pool of crimson and mud just inside the reach of the kitchen's light. Alyssa closed her eyes and jumped over it, forcing herself to flee the horror that she had witnessed. The girl ran for the first light she saw, the main office cabin that doubled as Nate's personal quarters. Alyssa now ignored everything around her except for that seemingly blessed light, and once climbing the couple of wooden steps and reaching the door, she found it locked. Nate had not yet returned. Alyssa banged and pounded on the door, yelling for help, when a firm hand gripped her from behind by the right shoulder, causing her to jump with fright before breaking down into inconsolable weeping. She peeked through her eyelids to find Nate. Nate had returned in frustration, having found no leads on Garrison's whereabouts and getting stuck in the mud for a time a few miles down the road. The little girl clutched at his waist tightly, knowing that she was now safe, but her sobbing persisted. Nate tried to ask the hysteric little girl what had happened, what she had seen or heard, but it wasn't until the door was unlocked and she was seated safely inside that she began to make discernible partial sentences from behind the blubbering. All Nate was able to make out was that Clefty was in his oven and something really bad happened to him. That was all he needed. Nate asked Alyssa to stay behind, assuring her safety with wooden walls and a door, telling her that he was going to go check it out and return with haste. The last thing he told her before leaving was to lock the door behind him once he had left. Once gone, Alyssa did just that. Nate made haste in the night towards the light in the mess hall kitchen, eking out in the darkness from the open doorway. Every step of Nate's feet sounded out with a squish. He noticed an odd-looking object laying in the mud beside the open doorway, just inside the range of light, but it wasn't until he was close enough to step on it that he accurately identified it as a severed limb. Nate stopped, gawking down at the appendage in horror, his hand raised to cover his mouth without even realizing it.
Oh my god.
Nate heard Dana's voice behind him. Nate turned to see Dana, an intense look of dread on her face, her eyes locked upon Nate's previous object of focus. "Dana, what the hell's going on out here? What are you doing out here?" Nate had to ask her 3 times before Dana finally spoke up, saying that she heard Alyssa's scream. Upon finding her missing, she made her way over towards the distant light of the mess hall in hopes of finding her there. Once she started, Dana found it hard to stop. She rambled on about how everyone was missing and that she didn't know where they were. Then, as she muttered out her next statement, her speech slowed and her expression changed to that of realization. There was no one currently attending the children. Nate assured her that Alyssa was safe in the main office, but urged Dana to gather up the children into one location, preferably one of the cabins, and stay with them. The lights suddenly went out all over camp. The light post, the kitchen of the mess hall, the office that contained a frightened young girl. Before she could even utter a word, Nate demanded that she hurry back to the children. He would retrieve Alyssa and call for help. The 2 of them ran off in opposite directions in the encompassing wet darkness, each of them with their own destinations and duties in mind. Neither one of them said goodbye in their panic, although they should have. Neither of them would see each other again. The chatter of numerous little voices was so loud, Dana couldn't make out a distinguishable word. The children were all frightened, and rightfully so, but Dana spared them the dire truth of their situation. She only told them that because everyone had failed to come back, assuring them that they were likely fine and holding up in some unknown dry place, that the lot of them were now to bunk together in the girls' cabin, boys included, under strict supervision. Although they weren't privy to any vital information, the kids sensed the intensity in the air and were nearly rioting, all rambling on about things that go bump in the night, including Jacob Treagle. There was a loud thump from somewhere outside the cabin, now lit with Dana's spare light source, her oil lamp. The sound wasn't loud enough to cause holistic silence or recognition, but it was enough for her to ask everyone to quiet down so she could listen more clearly. After a few moments of silence, nothing but the sounds of crickets and distant frogs, Dana asked the kids to start barricading the back door. Without any resistance, a bunch of the boys chipped in with helping Dana move whatever furniture and other large objects that they could to the back door. Once satisfied with the blockade, Dana took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and opened them when she told the children to lock and barricade the front door as well once she was outside. The kids began to riot again, asking her why and pleading for her not to go, but Dana knew what she had to do. She figured that maybe she could leave whatever was now stalking them in the camp outside, away from the children in the cabin. The pleading continued, but Dana paid it no attention. She repeated her orders before closing the door behind her. The night beyond the steps was nothing short of an abysmal void, space resolute in darkness. The crickets and frogs were sure to be heard, but the sounds of objects being scuffled about and slamming into the closed door behind her undermined them all. Dana stood on the porch outside, trying desperately to listen for anything that may be skulking nearby. Once she was satisfied with the children's fortification of the door, Dana began her run down the steps and towards the darkness beyond the reach of the lamp's light shining out the small front windows. Just as she touched foot on the ground past the final step, a forceful grip clasped her ankle from beneath the open-faced staircase. Dana fell face first into a large piece of slate at the beginning of a stone pathway. With a soft grunt that changed into a whimpering whine, Dana rolled onto her back, clutching her bleeding forehead with her hand. When she opened her eyes and looked up, she saw the outline of a tall black figure looming over top of her, Its tattered clothes dangled from its trunk and extremities, dangling from the arms that now reached down for her. Dana shouted out in trepidation, stopped short by a dark, wet boot slamming down onto her abdomen. The scream enticed curiosity from the children, all now fighting for positioning so as to look out one of the small windows in the front and see what was happening. Jacob gripped Dana's head with both hands and pulled against the counterweight of his foot, applying the force necessary to literally tear Dana's head free from most of her neck, the rest now dangling beneath her jaw. In unison, the children all squealed in fear, causing a once preoccupied Jacob to turn and face the cabin, tossing the head to the side and causing it to roll amongst the leaves until coming to an abrupt stop at the base of a nearby tree trunk. The kids scrambled at the sight of the menacing black figure, now distinguishably seen wearing some kind of sinister-looking human face mask carved from black, knotted driftwood. In their panic, someone gave an elbow in the wrong direction and knocked the oil lamp from the table by the door. The children backed away in a circle as each watched the fire start and grow before them. One of the girls shouted for someone to help her with the stuff at the back door. Jacob stood in place, watching the flames grow larger from beyond the window, listening to the screams of terrified children. He never moved an inch. The children all chipped in, the heat growing in intensity, but it took them quite some time to undo the work Dana had them help her with. By the time they had finally regained access to the back door, the entire front space of the wooden cabin was engulfed and searing with heat. The kids unlocked the door and gave it a shove. The door didn't move. They all tried it over and over again, slamming themselves into the door, but it would not open. Jacob had approached the cabin from behind, metal gleaming in hand. Jacob rammed a pair of garden shears between the deck boards in the back, right behind the door, resulting in the thump that Dana had heard earlier and currently denying the children's escape. Jacob looked on in front, the light of the fire illuminating the details on the mask's sinister grin in a flickering glow. Standing motionless and listening intently to the helpless pleading of 11 young campers. In the main cabin, Nate had just finished fumbling with something in the back closet. He asked Alyssa to stay close by, but she wasn't quite able to make out what he was doing in the darkness of the shelter. The only thing that she could make out was the last thing he grabbed, an item clutched in his hand that almost seemed to glisten, even with the absence of light. Standing up and moving towards the window, Alyssa identified the pistol in Nate's left hand. What she didn't notice until he started to use it was the cell phone held in his right, screen now aglow as Nate dialed the authorities. Placing the phone to his ear, Nate remained motionless for a moment before hearing someone pick up the line on the other end. Immediately, Nate went into what he witnessed on the ground, what Alyssa had told him she had found, and what Dana had told him. But before he could finish, the officer on the other end cut him off and told him that they indeed had a unit in the area. He comforted Nate in the fact that help was on the way, but as the officer was placing the dispatch call, the cell exclaimed a tone before dropping the call. Nate looked down at the screen and noticed that he had no bars. Stuffing the cell into his pocket, he informed Alyssa that he was going to go head over to the generator cabin, located on the shore to the lake, the front of which supported by pylons and wrapped with a wooden dock/patio. He told Alyssa to stay put, but she begged Nate not to leave her alone. Gripping the gun tightly in his hand, he decided she would likely be safest with him anyway. Nate asked the girl to remain as quiet as possible and to remain right by his side. Nodding her head, she looked up at him and agreed. The two of them crept slowly from the safety of the cabin and towards the darkness and the generator house within it. Nate made sure to grip Alyssa's hand tight, eking ever closer to the cabin on the water. The two made it unobstructed, but as they neared it, Nate noticed a flicker of a massive fire just beyond the tree line on the other side of the camp. A sense of impending doom welled up from within him as a terrible realization entered his mind. The children's cabin was on fire. The two of them now quickened their pace, Alyssa being dragged up to speed. She bombarded Nate with questions about the other kids, but Nate remained silent. Coming to the waterfront structure, Nate opened the back door, held it in place, and insisted that Alyssa enter and hide, waiting for his return. She once again initiated her own line of thinking, imposing questions and oppositions, but Nate simply pushed the child inside. He turned to once again face the fire in the darkness, hand still upon the edge of the door behind him, when he saw something approaching from the direction he intended for himself. Nate froze where he stood, squinting his eyes to see who it was that walked ever closer to him. The only thing he could see, however, was the silhouette of a tall, man-like figure, outlined by the raging distant flames behind him, getting closer and closer with every step. Nate called out to whoever it was, going through the list of missing personnel. He was prepared to fire the gun in his hand, but hesitated to do so until he was sure that it wasn't one of the campers. By the time he could see the details of the silent menace before him, his heart felt as though it now resided in his larynx. The being only a few feet from him. Once the details of the tattered black clothing and the facial covering were clearly distinguishable, Nate knew what it was that he was up against. He knew he was up against a force that he had been running from his entire life. A force that he was now prepared to deal with. Nate pointed the pistol and fired at nearly point-blank range. As Jacob swung his hand at Nate's loaded gun, knocking the gun from his grip and sending it to the wet ground at their feet, Nate found himself astonished and petrified at the man's apathy of being shot. He had to have hit him. There was no way that he could have missed. But the man didn't hesitate a movement. Stepping back, Nate opened the door behind him and slammed it shut after entering. The moment he locked it, the beast outside began furiously pounding on the door. Seemingly ignoring the sounds of splintering wood and Alyssa's screaming from somewhere in the dark, Nate fumbled with something in his inside coat pocket, yelling to Alyssa to get out through the front door leading to the dock out front. At first, he noticed no such action, but after pulling free the contents of his pocket, he turned and yelled the order again, causing the young girl to obey and slide the glass door to the side. Alyssa had stepped through the threshold just before the splintering sound climaxed in a loud, cracking boom. Nate yelled for her to run. Alyssa turned to face the gaping darkness of the generator house behind her, only to see Nate running at her. Without a word or breaking stride, Nate pushed the little girl so hard that her feet left the wooden decking as her body flew outward off the dock and into the water. Darkness. Cold, muffled darkness was Alyssa's only sensation. Throwing her hands out above her, the little girl struggled to reach the surface. Coughing and clearing her sinuses, the girl wiped her eyes free of water and splashed in place, focusing at the dock through her clearing blurry vision. She regained full sight just in time to see Nate holding something in his hand, something that reminded the girl of a 4th of July sparkler. Nate stood facing another man. The other man was focusing upon him, his black clothes sopping wet and ravaged by rot. In that same instant, Nate ran at his attacker, their attacker, and threw his arms wide open, using his body weight, gripping the man tightly by the waist and lunging forward. The two of them plunged off the side of the dock, into the water together. Nate never lost his grip on the lit half-stick of dynamite in his hand. The water exploded from the place where they had gone under. The shockwave echoed off the ground deep beneath the lake, causing a resonance that Alyssa could both hear and feel with her body. Alyssa gasped and gulped for air now, fighting her way towards shore. Splashes and thumps of falling bits of flesh and gore rained down onto the lake's surface while she did. It was when she reached the shore, clutching at the rocks with her skinny little fingers, that the glow of red and blue flashing lights could be seen reflecting off the tree branches above her, which she now stared at. Alyssa didn't move until she heard the police officer's call. The carnage at the campground was beyond the tales and legends passed down by the community. The brutality of the region could no longer be denied. Disappointed and stained with shame, the owners were forced to close down the camp. Alyssa recounted her experience to the officers, and thanks to her testimony, each victim would be found and laid to rest. If you ever happen across a sign saying, "Just a gosh darn camp," planted beside an overgrown plot of land, heed the keep out signs. You see, despite a large investigative effort that included combing the forest and dragging the lake, no trace of the camp's killer was ever found. Only a set of boot prints that dissipated and progressively became less definable as the soft earth began to stiffen, heading out and away from the lake.
Well, summer may be done, but if you're here watching this, it probably went better than maybe a few others. And hopefully you'll come back again next weekend for the glorious return of Confronting Evil. And until then, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so I can catch you all again next Saturday.
Social media can be very unpredictable, especially regarding horror content. If this content gets removed, all new content will be simultaneously presented on various websites provided in the description to this video. Make sure to follow me in other digital spaces so that you never miss out on the terror. Also, if you like this video, make sure to leave a comment and hit the like button. It helps the channel a lot. If you're new to the channel and you enjoy what's here, consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you never miss an upload. Writing is a dream of mine, and it's all of you that make that dream come true.